Welcome. I'm joined by a very happy Irishman in Sean O'Brien and also Alan Gilpin, the CEO of World Rugby. How are you, and did you get along to any of the games this weekend?
I didn't get along, Alex, but I did watch them all from the comfort of a sofa, in the dry and the warm. So, yeah, very good, thanks.
Also, I'm liking the fact that we're dressed exactly the same.
I haven't got the bootcut jeans like you, but
I don't want bootcut jeans.
Moving on. So let's talk about the Ireland-Wales game straight away. Ireland, so impressive. What was the most impressive for you?
Just the amount of options they had in attack. I thought the pace they played at, the breakdown was phenomenal. Wales are a very, very tricky side to play against defensively because they try and slow you up, they try and be a mess at that area. And I think Ireland, just their efficiency in the breakdown and their efficiency with options everywhere at the line, I thought they were just brilliant in attack. And they'll be disappointed with the game, I think, against that Welsh side. With how many more scores they could have got. But a great start to the Six Nations.
I think for me, the standout with the front row. I saw a stat, I think the Irish front row and the replacement front row had made 110 metres from their 22 passes that they put in, and the Welsh had put in 6 passes, 17 metres, something like that. And, you know, that's nothing against the Welsh front row. It's just how impressive the Irish front row are at the moment. Their ability to either take the gain line on with their footwork, to pop short passes, to play out the back. You know, Tag Furlong at one point was falling over and still played Johnny out the back to run through. So I think that element they've added to it is really impressive. And you know, what did you make of it yourself, Alan?
Yeah, no, I thought Ireland's intensity was superb. I mean, right, obviously to score so early, but right from the off, you know, they never let up in terms of intensity. I think, as you say, Wales found that really hard to deal with, and you know, in a funny kind of way, I think Ireland would be disappointed to have conceded any points at all, and you know, could have had a shutout. So, you know, tough afternoon for Wales. Exactly as you say, I think it'll be really interesting to see Ireland match up with France. You know, Ireland's pack was superb on Saturday, but France have got a great pack. You know, France seem to be in a place where they've got a player they can switch out in the pack that's just as good in every position, which is incredible. So no, I think that's a hotly anticipated game.
Just talk to us about you know, Six Nations first game. To get that kind of win, momentum is so big, and having a tough test against Wales compared to maybe Italy being a bit easier for France. You know, how does that? What position does that put Ireland in?
It puts them in a really strong position, I think. And the first one, it doesn't matter whether you're home or away. You lose the first one, it's going to be a tough tournament for you. That's how good this tournament is. That's how exciting it is. So for them to go out and play like they did, and again, I will say I think they'll be disappointed with the amount of opportunities they left out there, and that's the scary thing I think for France, and the danger for France, that Ireland will get better. I think they'll get a little bit better than they were last week.
I think France will as well, and you know, classically, you know, everyone has a plan until they get hit in the face. So let's see what happens there. Moving on to England-Scotland. What were your thoughts on that?
I thought Scotland were impressive all round. I think they were well set up. I think they seemed, and I'm not sure it was the game plan from Gregor, but they seemed comfortable to let England have a lot of the ball, and England didn't probably do enough with the ball to really challenge Scotland's defence. I thought Stuart Hogg had a great game. You know, in tough conditions, you know, Finn Russell, you know, when he needed to be, was creative. We saw that obviously with the 2 cross kicks that led to the penalty try. So I thought Scotland played really well. Maybe played the conditions smartly as well.
How hard is it playing at Murrayfield in the wet?
It's an incredibly hard place to play, especially in those conditions against a bunch of maniacs. And I think that's what Scotland were better without the ball, I thought, at times at the weekend. And they did play a little bit smarter, I thought, than England. I did think their restart and stuff, they always kind of let England back into it a little bit, though. They were a bit sloppy in a few areas, but they'll get that right this week. And England's attack, I genuinely thought they missed someone to get them over the gain line and to play a little bit tighter and to be more of a bully against a really tough Scottish defence. But Scotland's defence was brilliant. I thought Matt Ferguson at 8 was incredible all day as well. Hamish Watson, I think he still hasn't missed a tackle.
163 tackles without missing one.
Without missing one, he was incredible. So they had a few big performers again. Finn Russell pulling the strings.
Just to be clear, not just in that game. He only made 14 in the game. But.
So a lot of their players played well. It'll just be interesting now this week. Can they back it up? Back up a big performance, another big performance, and that's where they've probably lacked a little bit over the last few seasons. But are they in a better place? Scotland are a very, very dangerous side at the minute, I think.
For me, I was really, really impressed with Darcy Graham. He beat 6 defenders, I think, or more, and more than the whole England team put together, I think. And also, he is tenacious at breakdown. He obviously got a last turnover of the game. He also got one earlier. I was very impressed with him. He was something special. Also really impressed with Finn Russell, not just the 2 cross kicks, which were great vision and execution, but a key moment when England had gone down to 14 men and they gave a penalty away, got to halfway, and they weren't really going anywhere, Scotland, and Finn just came back down to the blind side, smashed it into the corner. Whether he knew they couldn't get Hooker on or they weren't going to bring Hooker on, I don't know, but it was clever enough to put England back into a corner and make a decision.
Madness by Cohen Dickey.
Well, look, Hooker's out on the wing.
Yeah,
It's not great, but at the same time, he's in a compromised position. And I know as a fullback, you're backpedaling. You don't know where the wing is about to climb all over you. You can't jump, and you're just trying to get something on it. Now, of course, his actions were very obviously whacking it forward. If he tried to just palm it back to Marchant or someone else, then fine. But I think he was just in a really difficult, tough position, which he's not usually in. He's got a winger about to climb all over him. He doesn't know where he's coming from, can't see him, and
it's a difficult one. But he got it. I was kind of saying when I was looking at the time, I was like, you've got both hands to it. Try it, attempt to catch it actually. But like heated moment stuff, obviously, he's on the back foot chasing back. He knows there's a winger coming over the top of him. It's a very difficult one, but the right call.
Yeah. France, Italy. What did you make of France? Slow start, and then they came into it. Who impressed you there?
My man Penno.
Your man?
Yeah, my man.
Good mates here?
Yeah, real good friends with him.
Yeah, on first name terms?
Yeah. I think...
what is his first name?
I think Demian.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. I think he was very impressive again. Just dangerous when he gets the ball, isn't he?
You can't just say that people you've picked in your fantasy team look really dangerous.
Well, it's justified.
Because justifies telling the other winger who scored a hat-trick,
Dupont.
Villiers, who scored a hat-trick, he was dangerous.
I still like Penno better. No, I think when they got moving, they're obviously they looked impressive too. It was a slow start by them, but they'll get better this week.
So with the first round of matches done in our predictions league, Shawnee got off to a flyer. It pains me, and he has been insufferable here. He got one exact result right with the Scotland game, and then 2 correct wins, basically. So you are top of the Legends League, Shawnee. How does that feel?
Feels good. Feels very good. Anything above you, which you're in about 501st, I think, and I'm 10th.
I backed the country. They were very close to winning.
Close.
Yeah.
Close never bulled a cow.
I don't even know what that means, but we're going to move on. There is a shout out to one of our listeners, Tim Newton. He not only got 1 perfect result, we got 2 perfect results. So he is flying up there. So looking forward to next week. Who are you going for? First up, Wales versus Scotland.
I am going Scotland by 9.
I will go with Scotland also, but I think by 4 or 5, so I'll go 5 points. Alan, your view on Wales-Scotland?
I'd probably agree with you both. I think Scotland probably to edge it. I think high-scoring game. I think both teams will go out and play some rugby in a cracking atmosphere in Cardiff. So yeah, Scotland I think are looking in good shape.
Could see some magic from Finn there. Yeah. On to France-Ireland, Shawnee.
Yeah, this is going to be the game of the tournament, I think.
Agreed.
And my head is saying Ireland. I just think in France, it's going to be a difficult task to overcome. They've done it before, the boys have. But I'm gonna go with Ireland actually. Even though I'm kind of thinking France, I'm gonna back my fellow teammates, and I'm gonna go Ireland plus 7.
Now I did
big call.
I did.
Big call.
I said Ireland would win the Six Nations. That was my call for him. But in order I need to catch you up on this predictor league. So I will go France by 3. Alan.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a cracker. Really, I think, as you say, game of the tournament potentially. I think both teams will go and play, some great rugby as they showed this last weekend. I think France with the home advantage, probably just going to shade it. So I think high-scoring game, but France just to win by maybe 5.
Allez le bleu. And then Italy, England, Sean.
England by I'm going to say England by 40.
By 40.
Yeah, I'm going big this week.
I will go with England by 25.
Oh, you're not going to catch me. You're not gonna catch
25.
me.
Yeah,
My
okay.
predictions
England
like
by
that.
25. I think at home, Italians will start well and then England will go away with it. 28. England by 28.
I think, I think England will win. I think if Italy can play in the first half as they did against France, they'll make it tough for England. So I think England by maybe 20.
Nice. There we have it. So, Shawnee, we have the pleasure of having Alan Gilpin, the CEO of World Rugby, to join us. How are you, mate?
Very well, thanks. Yeah, good to see you, and thanks for having me here.
Just give us a bit of a background about yourself in terms of how you became CEO of World Rugby and what you did before that.
So look, been World Rugby for 8 years, CEO for the last one of those. Before that, I joined World Rugby to head up Rugby World Cup, men's and women's, and I'd been involved in that in the past. About 20 years ago, I was a lawyer for my sins originally, and I thought, how can I, if I'm going to do this, how can I do it in something that I'm really passionate about? So, joined a big sports marketing agency and got involved in Rugby World Cup. Loved it. Loved the big events. Loved the kind of doing that type of work, and then left that agency and went and worked on the London Olympics, which was just too good to pass up, a home Olympic Games, and then came back into rugby after that. So yeah, a long history with Rugby World Cup in particular.
And favourite World Cup?
I think probably favourite event, Rugby World Cup 2003, and actually not just for the England win, but my first taste of kind of being behind the scenes in a Rugby World Cup and a big event. And I think back then, and I still think this about Rugby World Cup now, it's quite special to be involved in something that you feel still growing, and you've still got a personal ability to influence that in a way that maybe I've got lots of friends who work on FIFA World Cups and again Olympic Games, and I don't think as an individual you have quite the same impact.
Probably less pressure as well in terms of 2003 for like players, the groups, everything, because of like the amount social media has grown, the amount of expectation on everything, like the World Cup as a whole, the players, coaches, everything.
Yeah.
So it's probably more fun, actually.
Yeah, and different, definitely. As you say, it's changed, I think, and certainly for you guys, for players, it's changed more than for anybody in that time.
Yeah. And talking of that, what a big year it is. This year you've got the Six Nations, you've got the Women's Six Nations, you've got Sevens World Cup, and then you've got delayed Women's World Cup in the autumn. I guess there's so many big events. What's your aim for the year? What did you set out at the start of the year as to expectation for World Rugby?
Yeah, it's a good point. Look, it is a massive year. It feels like every year's a massive year now, which in itself is great because it just means there's a lot going on and we've got great opportunities. Last year was a delayed Olympics. That was a massive opportunity for sevens, in a tough environment in Tokyo. This year, as you say, we come into 2022 with, so much to get hold of. Particularly excited, I think, about Women's World Cup, making sure we do that in a really positive way. Sevens World Cup in Cape Town should be awesome. Commonwealth Games just before that for a number of those teams will be interesting as well. So, and of course we're just into the Six Nations. So yeah, there's a huge amount on. I think for us, it's about how all those things join up, to be part of a growth story for the sport and get more people interested in the sport. And again, Six Nations, men's and women's, and then the under-20s will be a big part of that. Getting people excited about being back in stadiums, which is great after 2 years of not having that. So it's a really big year for us.
And you talked about the women's game and the World Cup, and we're unbelievably excited for that ourselves. But just in terms of the growth, obviously it's huge steps have been taken, but it's really that what can World Rugby do to help grow it? I know as players, the men's players, we have a role to help promote it, to get behind it as much as possible. But World Rugby, apart from holding the World Cup and the Six Nations and having more televised events, what else World Rugby trying to do to help that?
Yeah, look, there's investment needed at every level in the women's game for sure, and women's rugby is a really young sport and a really, really young professional sport, and there's lots of challenges that come with that, but there's an enormous opportunity that comes with that. So, we're seeing player numbers around the world, and not just in the established rugby nations, but player numbers around the world really growing. But like with anywhere where rugby's growing or we're trying to grow rugby, there's a lot you've got to put in place to make that work and make that be sustainable, whether that's on the coaching side, whether that's match officiating and the medical side of the game. So there's a huge effort, I think, to push into investing in the women's game. Alongside that, how do we build out the competitiveness of the women's game internationally? And, that's a big focus for this year, obviously, with the Women's World Cup, because you know, in order to be inspired to play the game, boys and girls want to see their own national teams do well. So we've got to make sure we're bringing the women's game as a whole forward quite quickly, and not just seeing one or two nations, you know, really pushing ahead as maybe we saw last November. So investment is the biggest thing, and that requires us to grow revenues and everything else we do, and really have a very focused approach to the women's game. But it's exciting. And again, I think with the women's game, we've got a really unbelievable opportunity not to repeat maybe some of the mistakes we've got in the men's professional game. When you look back over, you know, 25 years of professional rugby in the men's game, and you guys know better than anybody, how congested the calendar is, what that means for players, what that means in terms of the competitions being the best they can be. We've got a chance to organise the women's game, I think, 7s and 15s in a slightly different way.
Is the plan to get every, like, Six Nations, for instance, fully professional in that women's game, for them to have the same opportunities? I know there's a lot of them over here playing the UK now and are very happy to do that, but a lot of them have lifted their whole lives, jobs, family, put their plans on hold in terms of getting married, kids, all this stuff. So, like, when do you foresee this happening? Maybe, like, when is this ball going to get rolling that it's actually right? There's going to be a women's professional game in Ireland. There's going to be a women's professional game in Wales. Already England is growing so strong. I go to some of the women's games. They're class games to look at. Like, when is it going to be even playing field, really?
It's difficult. And look, I think it's never gotten there in the men's game, even in terms of, you know, the investment that different nations and different, you know, professional clubs, again, as you guys know well, make into the game. So I think our challenge with the women's game is, how do we get everybody to a base level? And get those basics right. You know, you mentioned Ireland there. You know, they've been called out, I guess, you know, within Ireland for not investing in the women's game. I know Kevin and the team in the RFU are really seeking to address that. We're seeing, obviously, and we saw this last November, England and France, you know, flying ahead maybe in women's 15s in particular, with the investment they've made, you know, with the professional leagues they've put in place. They're attracting great talent. And maybe it's fine if the best Irish and Welsh and American female players are playing in those leagues for a short period of time to build their own competitiveness. But obviously over time, there's got to be the best, you know, Irish players playing where Irish girls can see them and be inspired. But what we're seeing, I think, in the last couple of years is more of rugby's kind of ecosystem understanding. Do you know what? The competition's not amongst all of us. It's with everything else that people's attention and time is spent on, not just other sports, but, you know, where people spend their time and their money. And if we can pull together as rugby better, we've got a better chance of doing that.
Would you say that's the biggest single challenge for you, is bringing all the nations together, not thinking selfishly, oh, we want to get this out of it, or South Africa that, England that, New Zealand want to get this, actually pulling together so we can have such growth in the game and get more people playing, more people involved, emerging nations, a better brand for the spectators, for the players, everything. Is that the biggest challenge?
It's one of the biggest challenges, definitely. But I think that kind of need for collaboration applies to, you know, everything we all do, and that's the community game and minis on a Sunday morning, right through, obviously, to the elite international stage of, you know, have we got a plan for the sport as a whole? How do we implement that plan around the world? So that's definitely one challenge, doing that together. The other big challenge for the sport, obviously, is the player safety, the player welfare piece at every level. But again, we're going to be better if we attack that together too. So we've got to work together as a whole to be successful and to try and grow the game.
I guess on that, is there anything we can learn from other sports then?
The sports that are more global, and, you know, football or soccer, as we've talked about, you know, such a simple sport, so easy for people to understand, easy for people to play and, you know, to get into. Probably similarly with basketball, you know, another sport that's very global. So there's things we can do, I think, to look at other sports, and, you know, maybe it comes back to simplifying a little bit. And if not always simplifying the game, simplifying how we present the game, talk about the game. You know, we've got a sport that sometimes we make it difficult for people who haven't played it and don't watch it on a regular basis. We make it difficult for them to come in to rugby. So we've got to, you know, take responsibility for that, you know, as a whole. I think when we think about rugby in new territories and globalising the game, there's definitely things we can learn from other sports. And, you know, whether that's, and it's probably quite a vogue subject now, whether it's a lot more of the sort of, you know, last dance, drive to survive, how do you use non-live action to really excite a younger generation, younger audience? Is it esports and gaming? Most of those innovations we're not doing as well in rugby as other sports are. sometimes the barrier to that is it requires us all, players, teams, professional leagues, and the international game, to say it's only going to work if we all do this together.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the things we've got to do is give the players a better voice in that, because the players are the stars of the show here, and that's absolutely going to be the case as the women's game grows. So let's build from that point of view and give the players that stage and that opportunity to be the stars. That's what, again, I think the younger generation of fans that are following the Drive to Survive example or The Last Dance are really kind of going for.
Like that had me, both of those had me like enthralled. I was like, Jesus Christ, this is
Yeah.
unbelievable. Like, has World Rugby been approached by Netflix to do anything like this even?
We've had a couple of conversations with some of the producers around some of those shows, and again, without sort of sounding too sort of dull and corporate about it, the challenge is always, who owns the kind of IP around that. So great, we want to do that. How do we get access to the players? How do we get access behind the scenes? It's the all or nothing shows are a good example in NFL. It's so much of what you see and what's compelling isn't the footage. It's what's happening in the family environment. It's the player who hasn't made the cut. It's the issues that players are going through, the personal and human experiences they're going through. So I think there's some good conversations taking place. There's a lot more conversations to take place, but ultimately it is going to be for us about bringing different groups together. And that's true whether we're talking about the kind of behind-the-scenes docuseries or we're talking about NFTs and digital collectibles and all of those types of things that, again, are getting kids really excited about sport.
I think that's one of the things that the MLR done really well last year. Some of the video content and their ideas was brilliant and very like behind-the-scenes type stuff.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that over this side of the world yet, but like I suppose they're very into that with NFL and all their sports over there. But it's definitely something I think that fans would really, really enjoy.
I guess from my perspective, the growth of the game is so important. And you want to have as many people playing, but you want to have new countries, new people playing all the time. And I guess the question is how do World Rugby and how does rugby kind of use the markets like Japan and America where rugby is there, but can grow so much. There can be such big uplift and huge, money brought into the game, but also not the detriment to the Pacific Islands, who provide so much talent to teams across the world, clubs across the world, and trying to help them as much as possible so that they can put out their best team every time they go to the Autumn Internationals or World Cup. And that balance, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, that again needs to be a kind of whole sport plan about exactly as you say there. How do you make sure we are growing the game, not just in new markets, but actually retaining and growing player numbers in all parts of the game in the places where rugby's strong, and not doing the growth piece to the detriment of where we're already strong and established. But you can't take that for granted anyway. Player numbers are always challenging. We've come out of the back of 2 years of people, being locked up and not being able to play as much rugby as they have previously. So bringing everyone back, and it's not just players, is it? It's the volunteers on a Sunday morning, it's the coaches, it's the referees, it's the medics, getting everyone back, committing their time to what we all love as a sport. And we're seeing in most places those numbers come back great. Growing the game's challenging. Rugby's a complex sport. I don't need to tell you guys that. So it's a complex sport to get people to understand in parts of the world where they've never seen rugby before. But that's where we've got to be clever. We've got to use not just sevens, but non-contact rugby and other forms of the game, I think, to drive a product that people get excited about. And not everyone's going to want to play, and that's fine too. Can we grow audiences? And, Japan was a great example of that with the last World Cup. I mean, we had a 10-year runway to Japan 2019. One part of a project, for example, on that was, can we get 1 million new rugby participants in Asia in the 3 years leading up to World Cup? And we did, and that was great. The really sad thing about that, of course, is, March 2020, a global pandemic hits, and we haven't really seen yet the kind of legacy of Japan 2019 as a World Cup, but we will. I think it's given us great confidence to think about taking World Cup to other places in the world that aren't established markets. We're talking a lot about USA and North America at the moment, and the opportunity that, as you mentioned, rugby's got to grow there. I think, how successful Japan 2019 was, we'll need to judge in 5 years' time when we look back and say, are there more kids playing rugby in Japan? Are there more kids playing rugby in other parts of Asia? Is there a bigger audience there? Can we go back there with future tournaments, whether that's World Cups, men's and women's or other things? So success so far, but a lot more to look at.
I've kind of a thing about the whole complexity of rugby at the minute, like even with rule changes, etc. Like, is our game that we're playing at the minute, is it too complex for people to get? Like football, for instance, or soccer, as we call it in Ireland, is like a simple game, very, very simple. Rules don't change too often. Where we're trying to evolve, and I know there's safety elements, there's bits and pieces like that, and we've a contact sport, they don't. So there's obviously a higher risk, etc. But do we need to stop evolving the game in terms of like making it more complex for people to understand? And then, because I genuinely have people at home who have followed rugby and they go, when did that rule come in, or when did this rule come in, or what? Tell me, make me understand that. And I sometimes even get, I'm not fully sure on that, to be honest with you. So is that a thing we need to get right in order for the game to grow, in order for people to go, Jesus, I really like to look at this game now. It's fast, it's simple, it's entertaining. Like there's all of those things that runs through my head.
It's a challenge, isn't it? I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, you look at the game and you say, okay, and there's pressure both ways, I guess. There's always pressure on law change because people want to change the laws of the game to make it simpler in some cases, to create more space, to create more opportunities for attacking rugby. At the same time, we're always balancing that with the player safety angle. And a lot of the law changes that you've seen recently, whether that's 50-22, the goal line dropout, obviously the break foot in the front row that's being trialled in the Six Nations right now, they're all, at their core, they're all safety related law changes. So there's always pressure to change the laws. I think what we've got to do a better job of as a sport and take responsibility as World Rugby is, are we making sure every time we're looking at law change that we are doing it to simplify the game, to your point, to make the game more entertaining?
I think with the rules, I guess the frustration probably is a bit twofold. It's the players and the spectators. Is if we're constantly bringing in new rules every year, then, you know, because there was 5 new laws, I think, this year, which, you know, we're learning as players, spectators are trying to pick them up, and the 50-22 is an easier one, but there's others that are more complex, and I guess it's the timing. Those were fine probably because they came before the season. Players had time to adapt in pre-season, then bring them forward. But I guess too often it feels like rules are changing in the year. So like the breakfoot one a week before the Six Nations, and we're seeing free kicks slowing the game up during the Six Nations, which of course we all want the best welfare, and I'm not a hooker, so I don't know what that's like in that position, you know, but could that have waited until the end of the season?
You don't do any contact, but
yeah, exactly.
Just to be clear on that.
Yep, longevity, Sean. Yeah. You have a hip replacement.
Still playing.
Look, it's a good point. We've got I mean, again, this probably isn't that well understood, and it is a good question. We've got a law review process. At the moment, the law review process runs in 4 years around men's World Cups, which is fine, apart from the Women's World Cups are at different times. And so we've got to be a bit more thoughtful about that. A lot of discussion with the national players associations through international rugby players who we consult with on everything we do really in the game, saying actually, you know, we've talked about axle loading for quite a long time. This needs to be trialled now. And one of the reasons that it became urgent to trial that in Six Nations, and it will be in men's, women's and the under-20s, is that this year, because of that 4-year law cycle, in the final year before Rugby World Cup, there's a kind of moratorium. There'll be no change, again, unless there's something really significant from a safety perspective. So the breakfoot needs to be trialled now if it's going to come into law in time for the next World Cup. So and again, going back to Sean's point, it's a complex sport. And the challenge we have, you think about, you know, the laws or the rules in other sports, and in simpler games, if you like, is that they can probably make changes, look at it quickly and move on. We're constantly having to look at the kind of unintended consequences. You know, I'll give you an example. There's constant calls for you've got to cut the number of substitutes in the game. It's it's kind of manipulating the game at the end of the game because you've got these fresh players coming on, but also is there a safety issue with that? There's a huge piece of research undertaken again with ourselves and international rugby players to actually look at the data and say, are more injuries caused in that last 20-30 minutes when there are fresh players coming on? Is it the fresh players coming on causing injury to players who are now fatigued? And actually, you know, what does that data say? So we've got to constantly look at the unintended consequences of things that might seem quite obvious.
It's quite difficult even for you to do that, because let's say the substitution one, which is a big topic at the minute. How do you get the information on that, for instance? You nearly have to trial it again and go, listen, there's no substitutions.
Yeah.
This November, for instance, and then see how many lads get hurt.
Yeah.
I said previously, I think it'd be bad for the game, because I think the way the game has been played now, the speed, the physicality, everything. You have a lad in the last 20 minutes who's after, let's say you have someone like a Josh van der Fleer at the weekend, who's getting through so much work for 80 minutes. But that's okay. He's able to do that. He's an engine like anyone else. But you get someone like me, for instance, and at 60, I'm starting to fatigue badly. If the first 60 you've been very busy, then what happens the last 20? That's when you're more susceptible, I think, to get hurt. So it's...
But you haven't played 60 minutes for about...
Exactly, I haven't.
It's a ridiculous statement.
That's why I'm kind of fresh.
That becomes 40, they're done after a while.
But like, where does it, like, that's a tough one for you at World Rugby to actually try and implement and try and get some data around even. So that's even complex.
Yeah.
One of the things on that, though, is and again, we've got a game analysis department who live and breathe this, is go back and look at thousands of games over the last 4 or 5 years and analyse all those changes and when injuries occur, and do injuries occur to the players who've been more fatigued. And again, going back to the point about the women's game, it's really interesting when we start to look at the player safety aspects now in the women's game, which is obviously really crucial if we're going to make that investment and really push for growth, because you can do that in the men's game. You can say, right, I'm going to look back at the last 8 years of men's international rugby. You can't do that in the women's game because that data doesn't exist. And one of the things we realised in a lot of the player welfare work that we're doing specifically now for the women's game is that you can't make assumptions about the women's game based on the data you've got from the men's game. And concussion is a great example of that. In the women's game, those female players are suffering concussion in generally in a different way to men's players. They're presenting symptoms in a different way, and their recovery is different. So actually, what you quickly realise is you've got to invest more quickly in the young game that the women's professional game is, to understand all of that. And we just have to be really vigilant about doing that.
On the concussion protocol, obviously taking huge steps forward, rightly so. The graduated return to play now is set in place. It's 6 days. There's been talk about maybe extending that. What have the conversations been at World Rugby on that?
Yeah, loads of work, as always, on sort of player safety and the wider player welfare. And we talk a lot about player welfare being our, as an organisation, our kind of number one priority. And it is, and it's the sport's number one priority. And that's not just because we want to make sure we're protecting players, playing the game now, again, at every level. But also, we've talked about global growth. If we're going to grow the game, we've kind of got to earn the permission to do that. And what I mean by that is, what's stopping more kids playing the game in some parts of the world is either their perception of a sport that is injurious or their parents' perception of a sport that's injurious. So we've got to make sure we've got that, as I say, permission, we earn the right. And one part of that, and a huge part of that, is the kind of science and the medical data. And for example, one piece of work we've been doing over the last year with the University of Otago and New Zealand Rugby is looking at community rugby at all levels, from age grade all the way through to senior community rugby, and gathering loads of data with instrumented mouth guards, which is technology. I mean, you guys from using it in the Premiership, technology that's only been available really in the last year or so. So we haven't had this opportunity before. Now we've got this opportunity to understand what head impact looks like in the community game. That's going to be really important in informing, again, how we approach all of those protocols, but also being able to say to parents and to kids playing the game, what you're seeing when you're watching fantastic rugby on the television is being played at a very different type of sport to what you're experiencing at the weekend in community rugby. So don't make those assumptions. So that's one part of the player welfare debate. At the elite level, where obviously as a sport over the last particularly 10 years or so, we've really invested, really evolved, again, around the science. And we have to be science-led because, again, if we make the wrong assumptions and the wrong judgments in rugby, given the nature of the sport, people are going to be very seriously injured. So making sure we're evolving with the science is the most important thing. HIA, and again, you guys have experienced all this, is a really important part of that. How we've evolved, how HIA is used. I mean, you saw it with Ali Price at the weekend, video analysis used to identify that he'd had a knock on the head. He goes and does the HIA, passes HIA, comes back on, and that's as it should be. Graduated return to play, obviously, is another part then of the head impact protocols, and it's actually, I think, for us at the moment, the most misunderstood part, because graduated return to play, is intended to be effectively an individualised rehabilitation program, and why we're not doing even though there's a lot of calls for us to do what maybe some other sports are doing and rugby league's just done by putting a sort of, you know, a longer limit on, is that historically in rugby, looking back at the data, reporting of concussion was significantly underreported. We don't want that underreporting because it's causing players to put their own safety at risk. So we want to create a situation where they go through a proper individualised programme to return. Graduated return to play for rugby right now isn't 6 days, it's 6 stages. So the 6 stages, you know, a player goes through, having had the first 24 hours of presenting no symptoms, and it's only when you present no symptoms can you start the graduated return to play process. Then you go through those 6 stages. And the data we've got at the moment is that 70-odd% of elite rugby players don't return in 10 days. So it's not, most of the time, it's taking at least 10 days or more for players to return through the protocols. So we strongly believe, based again on the kind of science and the data, that if we said arbitrarily, okay, graduated return to play is mandated at 10 days, you're either going to get back to players underreporting concussion, or you're going to have players coming back when they're not ready to come back. The other part that's really important to understand around graduated return to play is that, you know, if a player is at a higher risk, that either means they've had a concussion earlier in the same season, 3 concussions in the last year, or more than 5 concussions in their sort of lifetime, if you like, of playing, they go through an independent concussion review process as part of that. So we've now got this process, independent concussion consultants, that we've previously implemented at World Cups, that we've rolled out across all men's and women's elite rugby. And again, you guys will be seeing that. So anybody who's coming back early or has got a history with concussion has that independent review before they come back, and that's a really important kind of confidence check, I think, for people. So
I think with that, that's been brilliant, because we all understand that way more now as players, and we know the consequences of concussion, etc., and the return to play. I think the very first point you made in this part of it about, you know, parents always ask me, Jesus, like, there's some amount of contacts in games stuff, and I've said exactly what you've said. It's a completely different game. What I don't know what message World Rugby has to get out there, though, or what data they need to get out there to people who are playing in junior clubs all over the world, that it's a completely different game at professional level. And that's what scares them at that time, seeing us on the telly. Like, we're trained animals to go and, you know, into battle every weekend. Their kids aren't trained like that, or they're like, you know, young adults or whatever they may be, whatever level they're playing at. But I think that's the biggest thing to grow the game. I see even my hometown people saying to me, oh, my son's not playing this year. He's 9 or 10 years of age. I don't want him to get hit on the head. I'm like, he's not going to get hit on the head if he's coached right. And it's, you know what I mean? Well, he might, but not the way she's seeing it on TV, obviously.
Yeah.
So that, I think, needs to be put out there straight away as soon as the research is done, or, you know, whatever information is gathered. I think that's the biggest thing with parents at the minute. They're so afraid of what's happening to us on a Saturday, and they're thinking their little Johnny is gonna end up like that. But they're chalk and cheese.
Yeah, no, look, and you're absolutely right. And I think there's a couple of pieces that, isn't there? Again, we're going to have this kind of data that backs that up, and for the first time, I think, be able to say to parents and to young players, this is what that risk looks like for you. As you say, it's nothing like the risk that you're seeing at the elite level of the game. So let's know what that is and be clear about that. And then everybody can own that risk and say, yeah, I get all these great benefits. We all know, you guys better than anybody, you know, this is a great sport, teaches fantastic life skills, great kind of physical and mental well-being benefits. But it comes with some risk, and that's actually one of the things we all love about it.
Is there any plans at the moment for? I'm thinking about my friend over here who might be retiring pretty soon. He's going to Knackers Yard. Not that I actually worry about him, because he's got so many fingers and so many pies. But for other less fortunate people, you know, is there any help for players who retire, or that aftercare? Is there anything World Rugby are looking into at the moment?
Yeah, there absolutely is, and I think it's part of that wider player welfare discussion. We talk about quite often player welfare, and we're really just talking about player safety, and we're talking about current players. And I think one of the things we're trying to look at now, and again, a lot of it is work we're doing with international rugby players, who in turn, of course, are dealing with their national players associations that you're all part of, is, you know, a rugby player's, you know, life cycle as a rugby player doesn't, you know, start and stop when you play your first game, when you finish playing your last game, it's got to go beyond that, and we've got to do a better job as a sport, and there is a focus on this to make sure we're looking after the rugby family long after they hang up their boots, and hopefully keeping people involved in the game as much as possible. And there's physical well-being parts to that, definitely, and again, back to the concussion discussions, there's mental well-being parts of that, and providing a better infrastructure for people to get the support they need. So that's definitely something I think you'll hear more from us on in the coming months, working with the international players groups.
I think that's a major thing, because anyone that I've talked to who's hung up their boots, it's a very, very hard transition out of the game. If you're doing something for 15 years, even at the start of this year, I was kind of thinking ahead, and I was getting very anxious about leaving the game. There is, I suppose, sounding boards, etc. But I think there needs to be something set in stone for people when they finish, and make sure they're looked after well till they're finally set up. I think a lot of people could do with a lot of help when they finish playing rugby.
I think you're right. No, I think there's definitely more the game can do, and we got to take a leadership role from a World Rugby perspective in that. And I think you can look at it and say, okay, we can look at it and say, well, that's the club's responsibility, or that's the, as you say, National Players Association responsibility. But actually, all of those moments and all those places need more resource, and we've again got to pull together more as a sport and say, these are the people who are driving our sport forward. These are the people, these are the actors on the stage that are creating what's making the sport what it is, and actually, we've got to look after those people long after they've hung their boots up, and there's a lot of work to do in that space.
Alan, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and it's been incredibly informative for myself and all the listeners. It's now time for Good Week, Bad Week, and this week's Good Week, Shawnee, goes to Royal Wootton Bassett RFC. Their under-17s team, as you can see from this clip here, were unbelievably helpful to a poor bloke who had his car stuck in the mud. It looks like the whole pack plus replacements have got down here, and the whole team even. Good to see number 3, who's actually meant to be a scrummager, doing nothing there. But yeah, they helped out, which is good to see.
I have a bigger question. Where is your man in the BMW think he's going, by the way?
He's doing some wheel spins through, I don't know.
Having a bit of crack,
He obviously thinks he's in a big defender, and actually he's not. So an error there. And Shawnee, this week's bad week goes to...
This week's bad week goes to the ball boys during the game of Biarritz versus La Rochelle. Where 2 balls came in on the pitch at the same time. So just as he throws it in, the ball boy throws in the ball as well. And as this continues, so Biarritz are obviously mauling and are in control of the ball. But the La Rochelle boys see the ball boy's ball on their feet and kicks it out. And so they both think they've won the game. I should say.
It's the last play of the game. I mean, it's absolute madness.
So it was, it's a bit of a crazy one, to be fair.
Only in France. And Shawnee, there's no sin bin this week. Instead, we're going to have a musical Six Nations roundup. No, not you singing. There's actually a professional. I think he's professional.
The Six Nations returned and Dublin was the opening scene. The Welsh lads, they got battered by the rampant boys in green. Aki, Ringrose and Conway secured the bonus point as they made 15 Welsh Dragons look like 15 little boys. Then off we went to Murrayfield where England faced the Scots. Marcus Smith was looking tasty, then Eddie took him off. Poor old Cowan Dickey, he spooned Finn Russell's kick. A sin bin and penalty try left him feeling like a tit. Italy, France on Sunday, pizza versus wine. The French were massive favourites, but the Italians started fine. Then Villiers scored a hat-trick and Les Bleus were having fun. There was Paris noise as the Fromage boys ensured their job was done. Week 1.
Outstanding. Wells Online will be going for him as well.
It's good work by him, to be fair.
Yeah, well, fair play to Ollie Hume. That's some singing there. Alan, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Pleasure.
Really
Thanks
enjoyed
for
it.
having me.
Shawnee, as always, great to see you.
Yeah.
In 2 weeks, we're playing each other.
We're going
that will be fun, eh?
Yeah.
You can put.
Stay away
I
from
don't
me at the
condone
breakdown.
gambling, but if you want to put money on Sean getting a yellow card that day, I would definitely recommend it. And I will dive. I put it out there early. I will make sure he gets off the field. So.
Referees will hear this now.
Yeah, I don't mind. They'll be happy to sin bin you for the crap.
Just stay away from me.
This has been House of Rugby, brought to you by Joe.